The Complete Personal Memoirs of Ulysses S. Grant. Chapter 6. Advance of the Army, Crossing the Colorado, the Rio Grande. At last the preparations were complete and orders were issued for the advance to begin on the 8th of March. General Taylor had an army of not more than 3,000 men. One battery, the siege guns, and all the convalescent troops were sent on by water to Bravo, Santiago, at the north of the Rio Grande. A guard was left back at Corpus Christi to look after public property and to take care of those who were too sick to be removed. The remainder of the army, probably not more than 2,500 men, was divided into 3 brigades, with the cavalry independent. Colonel Twiggs, with 7 companies of dragoons and a battery of light artillery, moved on the 8th. He was followed by the 3 infantry brigades, with a day's interval between the commands. Thus the rear brigade did not move from Corpus Christi until the 11th of March. In view of the immense bodies of men moved on the same day over narrow roads, through dense forests, and across large streams, in our late war, it seems strange now that a body of less than 3,000 men should have been broken into 4 columns, separated by a day's march. General Taylor was opposed to anything like plundering by the troops, and in this instance, I doubt not, he looked upon the enemy as the aggrieved party and was not willing to injure them further than his instructions from Washington demanded. His orders to the troops enjoined scrupulous regard for the rights of all peaceable persons and the payment of the highest price for all supplies taken for the use of the army. All officers of foot regiments who had horses were permitted to ride them on the march when it did not interfere with their military duties. As already related, having lost my $5 or $6 worth of horses, but a short time before I determined not to get another, but to make the journey on foot. My commander, Captain McCall, had 2 good American horses, of considerably more value in that country, where native horses were cheap than they were in the States. He used one himself and wanted the other for his servant. He was quite anxious to know whether I did not intend to get me another horse before the march began. I told him no. I belonged to a foot regiment. I did not understand the object of his solicitude at the time, but when we were about to start, he said, "There, Grant, is a horse for you." I found that he could not bear the idea of his servant riding on a long march while his lieutenant went afoot. He found a mustang, a 3-year-old colt only recently captured, which had been purchased by one of the colored servants with the regiment for the sum of $3. It was probably the only horse at Corpus Christi that could have been purchased just then for any reasonable price. $5, 66 2/3% advance induced the owner to part with the mustang. I was sorry to take him because I really felt that, belonging to a foot regiment, it was my duty to march with the men, but I saw the captain's earnestness in the matter, and accepted the horse for the trip. The day we started was the first time the horse had ever been under saddle. I had, however, but little difficulty in breaking him, though for the first day there were frequent disagreements between us as to which way we should go, and sometimes whether we should go at all. At no time during the day could I choose exactly the part of the column I would march with, but after that I had as tractable a horse as any with the army, and there was none that stood the trip better. He never ate a mouthful of food on the journey except the grass he could pick within the length of his picket rope. A few days out from Corpus Christi, the immense herd of wild horses that ranged at that time between the Uylsses and the Rio Grande was seen directly in advance of the head of the column and but a few miles off. It was the very band from which the horse I was riding had been captured but a few weeks before. The column was halted for a rest, and a number of officers, myself among them, rode out 2 or 3 miles to the right to see the extent of the herd. The country was a rolling prairie, and, from the higher ground, the vision was obstructed only by the earth's curvature. As far as the eye could reach to our right, the herd extended. To the left, it extended equally. There was no estimating the number of animals in it. I have no idea that they could all have been corralled in the state of Rhode Island or Delaware at one time. If they had been, they would have been so thick that the pasture would have given out the first day. People who saw the southern herd of buffalo 15 or 20 years ago can appreciate the size of the Texas band of wild horses in 1846. At the point where the army struck the little Colorado River, the stream was quite wide and of sufficient depth for navigation. The water was brackish and the banks were fringed with timber. Here the whole army concentrated before attempting to cross. The army was not accompanied by a pontoon train, and at that time the troops were not instructed in bridge building. To add to the embarrassment of the situation, the army was here, for the first time, threatened with opposition. Buglers concealed from our view by the brush on the opposite side sounded the assembly and other military calls. Like the wolves before spoken of, they gave the impression that there was a large number of them, and that, if the troops were in proportion to the noise, they were sufficient to devour General Taylor and his army. They were probably but few troops, and those engaged principally in watching the movements of the invader. A few of our cavalry dashed in, and forded and swam the stream, and all opposition was soon dispersed. I do not remember that a single shot was fired. The troops waded the stream, which was up to our necks in the deepest part. Teams were crossed by attaching a long rope at the end of the wagon tongue, passing it between the two swing mules and by the side of the leader, hitching his bridle as well as the bridle of the mules in rear to it, and carrying the end to men on the opposite shore. The bank down to the water was steep on both sides. A rope long enough to cross the river, therefore, was attached to the back axle of the wagon, and men behind would hold the rope to prevent the wagon beating the mules into the water. This latter rope also served the purpose of bringing the end of the forward one back, to be used over again. The water was deep enough for a short distance to swim the little Mexican mules which the army was then using, but they, and the wagons, were pulled through so fast by the men at the end of the rope ahead, that no time was left to show their obstinacy. In this manner, the artillery and transportation of the Army of Occupation crossed the Colorado River. About the middle of the month of March, the advance of the army reached the Rio Grande, and went into camp near the banks of the river, opposed the city of Matamoros, and almost under the guns of a small fort at the lower end of the town. There was not at that time a single habitation from Corpus Christi until the Rio Grande was reached. The work of fortifying was commenced at once. The fort was laid out by the engineers, but the work was done by the soldiers under the supervision of their officers, the chief engineer retaining general directions. The Mexicans now became so incensed at our near approach that some of their troops crossed the river above us, and made it unsafe for small bodies of men to go far beyond the limits of the camp. They captured 2 companies of dragoons, commanded by Captains Thornton and Hardy. The latter figured as general in the late war on the Confederate side, and was author of the tactics first used by both armies. Lieutenant Theodric Porter, of the 4th Infantry, was killed while out with a small detachment, and Major Cross, the assistant quartermaster general, had also been killed not far from the camp. There was no base of supplies nearer than Point Isabel, on the coast, north of the mouth of the Rio Grande, and 25 miles away. The enemy, if the Mexicans could be called such at that time when no war had been declared, hovered about in such numbers that it was not safe to send a wagon train after supplies with any escort that could be spared. I have already said that General Taylor's whole command on the Rio Grande numbered less than 3,000 men. He had, however, a few more troops at Point Isabel or Bravos Santiago. The supplies brought from Corpus Christi in wagons were running short. Work was therefore pushed with great vigor on the defenses, to enable the minimum number of troops to hold the fort. All the men who could be employed were kept at work from early dawn until darkness closed the labors of the day. With all this, the fort was not completed until the supplies grew so short that further delay in obtaining more could not be thought of. By the latter part of April, the work was in a partially defensible condition, and the 7th Infantry, Major Jacob Brown commanding, was marched in to garrison it, with some few pieces of artillery. All the supplies on hand, with the exception of enough to carry the rest of the army to Point Isabel, were left with the garrison, and the march was commenced with the remainder of the command, every wagon being taken with the army. Early on the 2nd day after starting, the force reached its destination. Without opposition from the Mexicans, there was some delay in getting supplies ashore from the vessels at anchor in the open roadstead.